Leadership is a three-legged stool. A three-legged stool never wobbles. Leadership depends on the leadership style, the follower's motivation and skill set, and the environment or context.
Hi everyone, welcome to the ECXO session, the European Customer Experience Organization. Today we have a special guest, Andrew Bryant, which will be talking with you about self-leadership and how to lead yourself in the CXO, the CX organization. But before that, before I introduce Andrew, I would like to introduce you ECXO, right? We are a no-profit organization which aims to educate the corporate European, the Europe corporate in the future as we are working toward that, right? In order to, in some years from now, having a maturity model of CX around all Europe. That's our objective in the end of the day with trainings, events, and other things that we are preparing. So we are going to manage the Q&A with my friend here, Vincent, which is also the CEO of Teletech, and he is one of the founder members of ECXO with me, and he's in Paris, by the way. And Andrew is in the left side, as you can see, recognized from the picture, yes. And he's in Portugal, even though he's a British citizen, but a global citizen at the end of the day. And Vincent, please let the people know how we are going to manage the Q&A, and then we proceed to introduce Andrew, and then we go forward.
Hi everyone. So after the introduction of Ricardo, we will have an introductory presentation by Andrew, and then you have a chat on the Zoom where you can raise your question. I will select your question, and then when we enter in the Q&A session, I could pass your question to Andrew along with the question of Ricardo and all that. So don't hesitate to raise questions through the chat, please.
All right, thank you so much. So now the big moment, we are going to introduce Andrew. So Andrew Bryant is a globally recognized author and expert on self-leadership, and that's where I become aware of Andrew. Yes, and I loved his book. I really advise you to read that because it will help in your self-skills. For nearly 25 years, he has worked as a C-suite advisor, executive coach, and keynote speaker for some of the world's most recognized companies and brands. And today here we have the amazing experience to have you on board, speaking to the ECXO, one day a recognized brand from everyone. Andrew, the show's yours, We, Vincent and I will take our videos off, and the show's yours. We are here with you all the time.
Okay.
Let me first pin you, and then I'm going to do the rest.
All right.
You are pinned.
I'm pinned. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you don't see me full screen, if you go up to the right-hand side of Zoom, there's an option to pin or spotlight the speaker, depending on the version of Zoom you have. The other thing I want to draw your attention to is that there you go. There is a QR code there to connect with me on LinkedIn if we are not already connected. And the reason that I'm inviting you to do that is I have LinkedIn connections, of course. But if you want the notes from today, then send me a message saying that you were at the ECXO event and that you want the notes, and I will send those to you. And that includes people who are watching this on video. So this is being recorded. And so if you're watching the recording, you can still connect with me on LinkedIn, and that saves you writing notes throughout the presentation, but feel free to write notes if that's what you like to do. So it's time to get started with the presentation, Growing as a Leader in CXO. And I'd like to start really with a bit of a story. And that story starts with, oh no, not another leadership seminar. And I need to take you back 20 years ago to the beginning of my career as a leadership consultant. And I was living in Australia at the time, and a client flew me to Singapore. And they flew me from Sydney to Singapore at the front of the plane. So I was feeling very VIP. I was enjoying their customer service experience. I got a cab to the hotel, and it was a beautiful suite in Singapore. And I began to hang up my suit for the next day's leadership seminar. And in fact, it was a 2-day program. And just as I was hanging up my jacket in the cupboard, a little note comes under the door of the hotel room that said, transportation has been arranged for you for the training tomorrow. So in my mind, I was imagining, well, what was I imagining? I was imagining that there would be a limousine to pick me up and take me to the training venue. I clearly was being overserviced. So the next morning when I went down for breakfast and I went to the pickup point, I was surprised there was no limousine. There was a limousine, no limousine. There was a grey van. And not only that, getting into the grey van were a whole bunch of people. And I soon realized these were the participants for my 2-day leadership program. And they had come from all over the world. They'd come from New York. They'd come from Nagasaki. And they had come from Europe, from Frankfurt in particular. And nobody actually recognized me. These were the country heads, country managers for this organization, many responsible for the customer service function. So I got on the minibus, somewhat I'm humbled by my imagination and the reality, but I was fine with that. It didn't matter. I got on a seat, and in front of me, I realized was the country manager from Australia and the country manager from London. And I was privy to their conversation. Australia says to London, do you know why? Oh, I apologize. London said to Australia, do you know why we're here? And Australia responds, another stupid seminar, another stupid consultant. And of course, I was that stupid consultant. And this increased my humility, but also gave me a tremendous insight into how leadership development is considered by organizations. Now, this is a customer service organization seminar, and yet I know we have participants from HR and from supply chain, from PMO organizations, other elements that need to develop leadership. And this insight about how organizations consider leadership development, the participants had been flown from all over the world to spend 2 days with me, but they didn't know who I was. They didn't know why they were there. There was no pre-framing. What a waste of money. And that's the question that I have for you today. What is a lack of leadership costing? Not just costing the organization, costing you personally, costing your organization. So if you are not in the sexy part of the business, the sales that brings in the revenue that you can celebrate a big contract, if you feel like you are between sales and operations, if you are between operations and the client in terms of supply chain, if you're between all of this in terms of HR, if you aren't developing your leadership, you are missing out on your ability to influence the organization. And if you've attended this webinar today, I imagine you're experiencing a level of frustration. If you're in charge of leadership development for your team, your organization, you need to be thinking about if you are not engaged in leadership, if your people don't engage in leadership, that's costing the organization in terms of culture, which impacts recruitment, retention, and of course, if you have unhappy staff, you're going to get unhappy customers. So what I'm going to do is pop myself over here on the side and introduce you to the Leadership Accelerator. This is a model that I use as a diagnostic tool to find out where people are on their leadership journey. Now, I've used the metaphor of a speedometer. Now, I live in Portugal these days, and the Portuguese love to drive fast. In fact, I learned to drive in England, where I'm originally from, and in England, they drive on the left. I've lived in America, and in America, they drive on the right. But in Portugal, they drive in the shadow of the car in front. So I had to learn to drive all over again, going back to a manual and a manual on the wrong side. But wherever you are, the metaphor here is that fast is better than slow. That if you can accelerate your leadership, grow your leadership, deliver accelerated results, that's good for you personally, that's good for the organization. Now, the Leadership Accelerator starts right at the beginning, right at birth. And I want you to cast your mind back to your birth. You probably don't remember it, but your mother carried you for 9 months and then brought you into the world with some assistance, probably from a midwife or a doctor. And you came into this world, you were slapped on the bum and made to cry, which could have been a hint in terms of your future. But then, within a few moments, you were given a name, a nationality, an ethnicity, and possibly a religion and a football team to follow. You see, you have been framed from birth. So frames are our viewpoints, attitudes, perspectives. We are framed from birth. Now, I'm speaking to a global audience from Portugal. As I said, I'm British. I have an Australian passport. I lived in Asia for 17 years. I'm married to a Brazilian. So in all of that traveling, I understand national perspectives. I also understand, having worked with organizations across the world, the difference in functional perspective, right? Customer experience professionals look at the world through a particular way. HR people look at the world through a particular way. Operations, supply chain, people look at the world in a certain way. And if you're not aware of that framing, it will slow down your leadership development. You see, when people are framed, they are likely to experience black and white thinking, fixed mindsets, and they're likely to engage in reactivity and blaming. Now, I know you watching here today don't experience any of those things, but if you have seen reactivity and blaming within your organization, then just pop a yes in the chat to know that I'm not just speaking to the ether, and that there really is somebody out there listening to this message. Now, the thing about being framed is that we always think we're right. If I'm in front of a Portuguese audience, as I was last week, I asked them who here is proud to be Portuguese, and of course, they raised their hands. And if I was in London and I'd say, are you proud to be British? They would raise their hands. And if wherever I am, if you're in Germany and you say, are you proud to be German? Because obviously, where you're coming from is the right perspective. So how do you get out of framing? Well, first let me ask this. What's the cost? Generally, we stay in a status quo. We keep doing the same thing the same way unless we recognize that there's a cost in the status quo and a perceived benefit in the new behavior. This is Grace. Let me introduce you to Grace. She is a coaching client of mine. And when I met her, she was an economist working for the Botswana government. And at the beginning of COVID, she was responsible for managing the flow of funds to business in Botswana to offset the impact of the pandemic. And she did a great job. She looked not only at just handing out money, but asking the question, how do I empower these businesses to make money, to adapt, to be agile during the pandemic so that they can use their spaces as a food distribution center? Or how do they change the way they do business that doesn't need face-to-face contact? She did such a great job. The US government asked her to a forum, a symposium, I think it was a forum, sponsored by the US Treasury, to talk about her success. Now, her framing was cultural. I'm from Africa. I'm from Botswana. I'm an economist. This is US, the largest economy in the world, and they're inviting me to talk about what my value proposition is, what I did. And she had imposter syndrome, and many of us experience that. We get the spotlight is shone upon us, and we're like, well, what do I know? The audience knows more than me. Now, if you do that, that will hold back your leadership. That will cost you personally, because if you're not visible, you're not leading. You have to get comfortable with the spotlight, regardless of your function. Now, the CEO is used to be in the spotlight. The CFO speaks to the board. But does somebody in a CXO organization have a voice? And I coached Grace to have a voice. Now, having a voice is the first step of leadership. But what if your voice is the opposite? What if it's too loud? I was coaching many years ago a partner in an international law firm. And he was really good at a particular aspect of law and was considered to be an equity partner in that organization, which is worth a lot of money under what's known as a lockstep system. In fact, it's worth about £1 million a year guaranteed. And he was passed over for that. So his framing actually cost him, close to £500,000 a year, because he didn't make it. Why didn't he make it? Well, because he was framed in terms of how he dealt with people. You see, human resources called me to coach him because he would refer to his associates, to the people that reported to him. He referred to them as units of production. Now, that cost him personally, but what would that cost that organization in terms of their customer service experience if he treated people as units of production? So let's move on from Grace and let's talk about what happens after framing. If we push through our framing, we do start to accelerate. What we tend to find is that because we carry that framing into our role, we get engaged in firefighting. Firefighting is going from crisis to crisis, and it's adrenaline filled. And particularly during the pandemic, there was a lot of this going on. And a lot of the managers who would be leaders fail because they get stuck in firefighting mode. And you know that you're in firefighting mode when you're going from crisis to crisis, when you're needing to follow procedures that may not be relevant anymore, and you're just executing instructions. Another leader that I coached some time ago was Nitin. Now, Nitin worked as a PMO, the Project Management Office, for the America's 12th largest fast food chain, responsible for over 3,000 stores. Now, PMO, like CXO, like supply chain, like HR, is not at the sexy end of the business. But his role was important across the organization, across 3,000 stores. His ability to put procedures in was so important, but he was going from crisis to crisis. So his voice as a leader was not being heard at the C-suite. Now, I helped him shift from firefighting through self-leadership into accelerated results so that he was chairing the monthly meeting of all the C-level leaders in terms of the direction of the organization. And we need to learn how to do that. But before I do, what is the cost of firefighting to you personally? What is the cost to your organization when the leaders and the managers are reacting rather than being strategic? What's the cost? Think about that for a moment. Because if you know that there is a cost from staying still, you can think about, well, okay, how do I accelerate? How do I get through the blockages of being framed? And firefighting, how do I accelerate? Because if you've ever been stuck behind a truck when you're in a hurry to go somewhere, you know what it feels like to be blocked. Now, the premise I want to share with you today is you can't lead others unless you first lead yourself. I mean, that's true. When you get on a plane, and what do the steward and stewardess always tell you? Should the oxygen mask fall from the ceiling, place over your nose and mouth before assisting others, even children. You can't lead others unless you first lead yourself. So in today's webinar, my challenge to you is to lead yourself if you're not already doing so, and to offer you a few things to think about that will help you move forward. Is that something that's of interest to you on this webinar today? Pop something in the chat box, let me know you're listening, and I will then be motivated to keep sharing with you. Now, in 2012, I published a book with Dr. Anna Kazan called Self-Leadership: How to Become a More Successful, Efficient, and Effective Leader from the Inside Out. Interesting story, Anna and I have never actually met, even to date. We co-authored a book through Skype we started the book in 2010, I think, and we did the first virtual meetings along the way, making sure that we collaborated on our perspectives. And we defined self-leadership as the practice of intentionally influencing your thinking, feeling, and actions towards your objectives. So self-leadership is a practice, right? Taking a shower is a practice. I take a shower every morning and every evening, because if I don't take a shower, after a couple of days, I know I will stink, and I know you know that too. In fact, you know people who need to take a shower, right? And we need to take a shower for our mindset and for our attitude. Now, there is a question here already coming through around, how do I change the framing of others? And I will get to that. Thank you for the question. So what does self-leadership look like? Well, self-leadership starts with self-awareness. As I said, you can't lead others unless you lead yourself. If you're not aware of your own behaviors and how they are impacting others, then the cost to your leadership is going to be huge. There is a strong correlation between self-aware leaders and their ability to lead others. Low self-awareness means low other awareness. You're emotionally unintelligent because you don't know what other people are thinking and feeling. How do you build self-awareness, and how do you build self-awareness in others? You invite people to reflect what is happening for you now. And I've been doing that through this webinar, challenging you to ask the question, what is this costing you? Now, later, I'm going to ask you, what is the benefit for this? But the reality, as I said, is people don't change behavior unless there's a cost of the status quo. And anybody who understands consumer behavior knows that. They know that they want to sell the benefit, but they also the cost of not purchasing their product. Now, self-regulation comes next, or emotional intelligence, choosing the emotion relative to the scenario. At a party, it's good to choose being excited, happy, having fun. If you have to attend a funeral, and I hope that doesn't happen in the near future, but it happens from time to time, throwing a party is probably not the right emotion to have. If you are in any customer-facing situation, you must be in control of your own emotions. You cannot take things personal, you cannot make things pervasive, and you cannot make things permanent. Now, we're all human, so we have to learn when we make mistakes. I'm version 6.1 of myself, and I am certainly better than version 5.0 or even version 4.0 of myself, and that is because I've learned along the way. And trust me, if I make a mistake, my wife will ask me, hey, why don't you go self-leadership yourself? This actually is my son when he was about 2 years old. And I imagine there's a few parents on this call. And if you've been a parent or you've been around a 2-year-old, you know that there's a certain stage of child development, and it happens around about 2, and they become very awkward. It's called the terrible 2, because they start to scream, it's mine. Another child would touch a toy of theirs, they'll scream, it's mine. And this is the development of ownership, which is incredibly important for our adult development and boundaries. We need to take ownership of our own thoughts and feelings, our own actions and emotions. This is my daughter, Tasha. And this photo of her taken on FaceTime, you can see me, it was obviously cold when this photo was taken. I'm wearing a beanie. We were separated during the pandemic. And so we stayed connected by playing Minecraft together. Because if you ask a teenager how was their day at school or how's it going, you get fairly singular monosyllabic responses. So we played Minecraft together. She's an expert at Minecraft. I'm the noob. In fact, in this picture, if I go to slide only, that's my perspective. I'm in flames and she's clearly in the best armor possible. So I asked her, I said, hey, can you help me enchant this armor? And she said, I could, but then you wouldn't learn anything. And this is the challenge we have in passing on self-leadership to others, is not doing it for them. Now, I was frustrated that she wasn't going to enchant my armor, but I was proud as a father because she's attended some of my self-leadership seminars and she knows this point about you have to take responsibility. She's in her final year of school before university, and I'm very proud she's taking responsibility for her studies. And if you want a reference in terms of does this stuff work and can I teach it, I think a teenager is the best example. Now, when you take ownership, when you apply and practice self-leadership, you become the driver of your life, not the passenger. You can see the driving metaphor is all the way through this presentation. And when you're the driver, and clearly that's a photograph of Jason Stratham, and what we have in common is we both are follically challenged, and of course, and we both drive Audis. That's about it. But when you're the driver, you can ask yourself these questions: where do I want to go? How do I want to get there? And who do I want with me? And when do I want to get there? How fast do I want to go? And the question about framing others is to ask these questions. What's your objective? What are you trying to achieve here? How do you want to achieve this? Who do you want with you? And how fast do you want to go? So challenging a frame is best done through asking a question. So I'm going at a rate of knots here, and I will stop shortly to invite you to come online and ask questions. And I would love to answer the questions for you, so you get some practice asking questions. So in my model, if you're framed, you're not going very fast. If you're firefighting, you cannot really deliver accelerated results. Self-leadership is the key to getting accelerated results, working on yourself. I tell every manager or leader that I work with, go buy a mirror. Because if you're not getting results from your people, then look in the mirror and see what you can change in yourself first before you try and change others. When you have self-leadership, you're able to develop executive presence and influence capital. Executive presence is defined as the ability to project confidence, gravitas, and poise under pressure, plus the ability to read the audience. It's very difficult for me to have full executive presence here. I can wear a jacket, I can look down the barrel of the webcam and attempt to connect with you virtually, but it's very difficult for me to read the audience in this format. But we've had to learn to do that and be versatile to do that. When you can read the audience, then you can get influence capital. You can invite the audience to see things, hear things a different way. And that's what leadership is about. Leadership is a process of influence that facilitates people to achieve group goals. That is the definition of leadership. Prior to the pandemic, and as the pandemic hit, I was working with Mel. Mel is a chief people officer of a Silicon Valley software company. And I'd worked with her CEO and the C-level executives of that organization, developing their self-leadership, working on their executive presence, and teaching them how to exercise influence capital. Mel said, "Thank you for the work that you've done for me personally. I now have my own voice. And thank you for the work you've done for the executive leadership team. But what I really need is to cascade this down to the next level of managers and the level of managers below them. And she attempted to influence me and said, could you write us a book, encompassing what needs to happen for these guys to step up, and girls, I guess, using it as a gender neutral term these days. What needs to happen for them to be leaders? Now, I agreed to write the book as long as I hung on to the intellectual capital, the IP, intellectual property of the book, so that I could publish it myself. And that came out this year in May. And because it was through the pandemic and that we had to adjust leadership for the fact that we are often communicating through Zoom or other forms, Teams, or whatever you're using in your organization, I wrote it for leaders in this time, in this place, in the new normal. And so I called it the New Leadership Playbook, being human whilst successfully delivering accelerated results. And that is the key. Remember I said way back with self-leadership that you needed to be self-aware, because then you are other-aware. Checking in with others is incredibly important. Now, if you're interested about more of my work on self-leadership or the book, all of the information for that can be found on my website, selfleadership.com, or you can request through the LinkedIn connection that I previously shared. In the book, I share 12 plays. That's why it's called a playbook. And frankly, a play is a conversation. You see, leadership is a conversation, and it's a conversation that has a framework that I have described here as setting clear expectations, which becomes a multiplier for mindset and motivation that plugs into the mindset and motivation of the individuals. As Simon Sinek said, start with why. And then that drives right behaviors. So what Mel from my Silicon Valley client asked me to do is to script those conversations in a way that people could learn from them and develop their own leadership. Most leadership books, frankly, are written at 40,000 feet. They're very abstract and about leadership values. In fact, if you go onto LinkedIn and you read any post, you will find that people say leaders are like this. Well, that's just tough. The list is so long. So you want to think about it as leadership is a conversation that leads to right behaviors. And we're going to have a conversation now. We're going to have a conversation for you to ask your questions about your challenges in becoming a leader. Before that, I've got one last story to tell you. Because I asked you, what does the lack of leadership cost? But so often, whether you're asking or requesting something within your organization, finance is going to say, what does it cost? What does it cost? What does it cost? Well, earlier this year, my wife and I were dropping off our eldest daughter to university for her first semester. Her name is Lila, and she's an incredibly bright student because she's got this place to do vet science at the top university in the UK. So we went to the UK and got her orientated, and we're having lunch in a pub before she starts, and she looks at me and says, "How much do you charge for coaching?" And I said, "Why? Do you need some?" And she said, "Yeah, I do." Now, Lila is my stepdaughter. Now, anybody who's got teenage daughters knows that they can be challenging. Having a stepdaughter, having credibility with a stepdaughter takes a bit of work. So for her to ask this question was a biggie. And she said to me, "Yeah, I need coaching." And I said, "Well, what is it?" And a few questions in, I realized she had anxiety about starting. I asked her, "Do you have enough data to make the decision about whether you've made the right choice or not?" And she said, "Well, clearly I don't, I haven't started." I said, "Fine, how long do you need to make a decision that you have the right course?" And she said, "Well, I guess a term or a semester." And I said, great, well, you got nothing to worry about. Commit for 1 semester. It's not the rest of your life. If this was the wrong choice, then we'll have a discussion and we can make an adjustment then. But right now, commit to everything. And she said, oh, that's amazing. She turned to her mother and said in Portuguese that, oh, okay, now I know why they pay him. And so what does that cost? What is somebody feeling good about who they are? What does that cost? What's it worth to you? So I'm going to leave a picture of Lila up for 1 second. Actually, no, what I'll do is I'll take it down and I'll go here. And I'm going to open to the floor. And Vincent, if you want to come back on screen, moderate, I can look over here at the chat. If there are any burning questions that I need to answer for our audience today around growing as a leader in a CXO. Okay. Vincent, you're going to need to unmute yourself to make that work.
You're right. I was on mute. Sorry, I am coughing a little bit.
And I still don't have any audio from you, Vincent.
Because
it might be me. Hang on a second. Try again. Off you go.
Okay. Do you hear me? Yeah. Okay.
I hear you loud and clear.
Okay.
Yeah, my speaker went to sleep.
So we received a few questions during your talk. I will go through the question we received, and you can still, as panel members, raise questions, and I would monitor them for you. So the first question that was raised was with regard to the framing issue, to say, okay, we all recognize that we have framing coming from our cultural background and so on, but how do we practically help people to change their framing behavior? Because how is it framing? It is something which is quite well embedded in ourselves. So how do we change?
Very good. So Vincent, I'm going to demonstrate with you. Vincent, you're French, I suspect, correct?
You're right. You're right.
Well, you live in Paris and you have the accent and the name. So as a Frenchman, you see the world through a certain French perspective, true or not?
I must admit.
Yes, you do. Of course you do. And Vincent, I suspect you've traveled, right?
It happened.
Have you ever had an experience where you were in a country other than France, a non-Francophile country, and suddenly you saw that there was a different way of doing things? Did that ever happen for you?
Of course.
So it is possible to see the world through a new frame, correct?
Yeah.
So we've established that sometimes we get an aha that our perspective is not the only perspective. And so whether this is a procedural issue, whether this is a standard operating procedure, I mean, in customer service, you know, if something goes wrong and I'm the customer, I will say, I understand that you have a standard operating procedure to how to handle this. And they say, yeah, this is it. And I say, that's great. Have you ever made an exception to that? And they'd say, yes. And I say, under what circumstance did you make the exception? And they say, this is the circumstance. And I will say, fabulous. That is the situation I'm requesting a change in procedure today. So next time they say there are no upgrades, you say, I understand that that's the procedure. Have there ever been any exceptions? Yes, when the individual had a bad customer experience with our airline. Fantastic. I'm having a bad customer experience. I'm wondering if you want to resolve that with an upgrade for me today so that you change my experience right now. Now, it's an example. It works sometimes, doesn't work all the time, but it's a demonstration that the step one in changing somebody's frame is to bring them to an awareness of the frame and to an awareness that there are exceptions to that frame. And that puts the individual at choice point to say, okay, I've always gone down road A, but there is road B and road C, and they are options, and at least I can look at them. At that point, you've got a negotiation. And that's how I would answer that.
Excuse me, I just want to enter in a second, just to ask a question about that. But this is something easy said than done, as because it's very difficult to change people that are many years in the same work, for example. I have so many people like that in my life, and it's very difficult to change habits of the people. Behaviors is maybe a bit easier, but people have their own mindset, as you mentioned.
Okay, I need to stop you there, Ricardo, because you have just transmitted your frame in the question. And this is the trickiest thing, because if I accept your premise that people a long time in an organization won't change their frame, nothing I say is going to make any difference. So, Ricardo, I just need you to hear your question for a moment. That you said, I know you didn't. I know you didn't. And that's the point. I've interrupted your pattern. And that answers the question. Stop allowing people to continue with a frame that doesn't serve you. Right? So I am demonstrating my answer rather than answer it. Because if I accept your presupposition that people cannot change, how can I answer your question?
No, I'm not saying that people cannot change. I'm just saying that they have some difficulties. Some people have many difficulties to change. I can bring you examples from Samsung that you will be stunned what the people did there. But the question is how we help them. What's the tools that they have in order to create the changes? Because people think that they are doing right and their behavior is what they see from their perspective, from their framing. So what will help the people to change that? That's my question.
Okay, so terrific. But you see, as a coach, I prefer to demonstrate. You see, talk is cheap, right? So this is why I interrupted you. But you said, I don't want to be interrupted. So now what I have to do is now I'm out of... No, well, you basically said, I haven't finished. So... And how else to say that you didn't respond to that, right? So the observation of the behavior, so I'm finished, right? So I get that. So here's the lesson for everybody watching. If there is no rapport, right? If there is no acceptance of the reality of the other individual, we come into conflict, which is what I just demonstrated. And you didn't know that I was going to do this, but I did anyway, right? If I live in Portugal, and if I'm in Lisbon, there's a choice between two football teams. It is Sportif or Benfica are the two sides, the two football teams. And, they would never agree that the other team is good, but they would agree that on terms of their love of football. So we have to find something that we both agree on. So I will agree with you. I will absolutely agree with you, Ricardo, that there are people who resist changing perspectives. I will agree with you that when you call them out, as I just did with you, that they may operate from a frame, they will respond badly. I get it. So the question, and the same question I gave to Vincent, is, has there ever been an exception where somebody has, after a period of time, had an epiphany, had a wake up and said, you know what, there is a different viewpoint. It only has to happen once. So the way that I remind people, the acronym I use here is PACE, 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 LEAD. A PACE is how we validate somebody's existing position. That reduces the resistance to change. So I'd say, hey, Ricardo, right? And you nod because that's your name, right? And you had a question, right? And you nod because you had a question, right? And your question is that some people find it difficult to change behaviors. Right, I get you, they do, right? Because it's framed, they are unconscious. So is it possible to raise their awareness that their existing frame is not serving them? Or as Dr. Phil of Oprah fame would say, how's that working out for you? So when somebody is engaged in a behavior that is not delivering them the results, you'd say, hey, I understand that you like to do it this way. I understand you've been doing this a number of years, but how's that working out for you? Does that give you the results that you want? It's okay, but does it give you the accelerated results you want? No. Would you be open to consider an alternative way of doing it? And now you're offering them a new perspective, having acknowledged and not made them wrong over their existing perspective. And that's how you do it.
Thank you for the response, Andrew, to Ricardo's question. As we have a sales community of people there, I wanted to know if there are anything regarding leadership development, which is influenced by the company itself. For example, the industry, the customer targets, the history of the company, if I am dealing with the startups or a brick and mortar. So how does the leadership model you are proposing is influenced by the company itself, if we want to be a bit practical and focused on the customer experience?
Yeah, I understand. And I understand there are some people that are dialed in who are not just CXOs. So the answer to this, when I very first started in business, right? And I had to get my first client, and then I had to get my second client. And every client says, well, have you worked with our industry before? Now, after nearly 25 years of doing it, I've worked with airlines and I've worked with manufacturing and I work with software and insurance. So I can say, oh yeah, I work with XYZ company and therefore I have the validation. But how did I start? Well, I couldn't tell them I'd worked with this company, that company. I couldn't name drop like I can do today. So I had to ask the question, does your company have people? And they said, well, of course we do. And I said, do you have to manage those people? Yes. Do you sometimes struggle with their existing mindsets as Ricardo asked? They'd say, yeah. And I say, okay, then that's where we start. We start with the people. Now, your question about culture and different types of organizations and different maturity of organizations, from startup to mid-sized company to established organization. Yes, things change. I'll name drop here a little bit. I work with Red Hat. Red Hat is an open source company. It was acquired by IBM, big multinational with lots of very rigid procedures. And trust me, the individuals within Red Hat struggled with the change in culture from everybody has an opinion to, hey, this is a directive from management, execute. Here's the way I help people think about this. Leadership is a three-legged stool. A three-legged stool never wobbles. Leadership depends on the leadership style, the follower's motivation and skill set, and the environment or context. So I'll give you a quick example, straight from the new leadership playbook. If you and I are on a plane at 36,000 feet and the oxygen masks do fall from the ceiling and smoke starts to swirl around our ankles, if the captain comes out of the cockpit and says, ladies and gentlemen, clearly there's a bit of a problem. I'd like to create some focus groups and get your buy-in in terms of what I should do about it. You know, even the atheists are getting religion at this point, right? This is clearly the wrong leadership style for the follower's motivation in that context. It's an emergency context. None of us know how to fly the plane. And so we need the leader to be very directive and tell us exactly what to do. If, on the other hand, we're working with professionals who are highly skilled in a stable environment, then the leader's style needs to be very participative, get buy-in, get ideas, and bubble those ideas up. And as much as possible, encourage the individuals to have self-leadership. So if I've got self-leadership, then I can invite others to take ownership and autonomy. Particularly post-pandemic, when many of us have had a taste of autonomy and responsibility working from home, to then take that away is like giving an ice cream to a child and taking it away. There's going to be screaming, and people leave organizations because they say, hang on a moment, you gave me autonomy. Now you want me to sit in a cubicle and you want to lean over my shoulder? No, thank you very much. So that's how I'd answer that question.
Yes, thank you. We had another question during the discussion regarding you emphasizing the idea that do not reaching the self leadership level or even the accelerated one would have a cost for the company, but as cost as are concerned, how can we assess a little bit the damages? Because sometimes to have investment, to say we need to improve our teams, we need to have programs, to hire consultants like you, we need to sometimes justify some benefits in front of some costs. So how do you measure some of the hidden costs of a wrong leadership model?
Very simple. What's the cost of an employee, right? So, an average, it depends on the industry, right? So I'll take one of my US clients for an example. An employee in that industry costs $250,000 a year. So if they lose that employee, right, then they're going to have to replace them. So there's a period of time if they have to use search consultants, engage 30% of cost. Now, if that was a C-level leader and their annual remuneration is upwards of $1 million, then that's $300,000 of cost from losing one C-level leader, right? So if bad leadership causes people to leave, then that costs. If bad leadership, investment in culture means that you can't hire people because they look at your culture, they check you out on Green Door, and say, I'm not going to work for them. So you can't hire people, then you can't scale, then you can't deliver your services to customers. That costs you market share. It's very easy to calculate this. I remember working in Mauritius with a bank there. And I was working with the senior leadership team, and this was many years ago. So I feel free to tell this story now. And so somebody's trying to work out which organization this was. And I was working with the senior leaders, and there was a sort of a subtle conflict between two departments. It was very polite, was Franco-Mauritian culture. Everybody's very polite, but there's tension and conflict. There was a lack of collaborative leadership between two departments. And each department was building an IT system worth millions and millions of dollars. And yet the bank only needed one of these IT systems, but each person wanted to own it. I have no problem with ownership, but when we are abundant, we can collaborate. Anyway, in this leadership session, we resolved this conflict, and the bank only needed one of these IT systems, saving them millions and millions of dollars in development cost. I leaned over to the head of HR and said, "You'll never complain about my fees again." And he smiled and said, "Different budget." So, that's an HR problem. Where does the budget come from? But the reality is, lack of leadership is costing. Just ask the United Kingdom what lack of leadership has cost them in terms of the Conservative Party rotating around their leaders recently.
Very right.
Yeah, it's cost them $65 trillion in terms of lack of leadership, right from Brexit being badly done to a series of, the lack of leadership has almost bankrupted the country. I mean, you can see the cost in terms of what the pound did against the dollar. So you just got to be a bit creative to calculate what is the impact if people are not leading. When you've got leadership, you've got engaged, empowered, creative, innovative individuals working to solutions. That's worth a lot of money.
Okay.
We have two questions now in the chat.
Yes, I have seen the question. That we have a question about how does leadership experience differ when you are leading volunteers, people, because you lose maybe a part of the financial incentive in that way. So it's a question from David from the chat. So how's there any difference when you lead volunteer compared to employee, which is the standard model?
Very, very, very good question. Now, I'm a past president of the Asia Professional Speakers Association. I'm the current president of the Spanish Professional Speakers Association, two volunteer organizations. Now, leading a volunteer organization is challenging because you have volunteers. Leading a speakers association where speakers generally have high ego and a high they have voice and they have opinions is challenging. The thing about leading a volunteer organization, in fact, I think I learned a huge amount about leadership by leading APSS, is that you have to connect people very much to the why, to the vision, the mission, why they're doing this, and how their contribution to the vision matters. So it is one of those areas, if I use that leader's style versus followers' motivation, volunteers generally are highly motivated to do what they think is right. And the environment, well, that varies. So you have to get buy-in right up front. Set out the vision, which every leader should do, but more so with volunteers. Get the buy-in and make sure you're listening to them. When I set up PSA Spain, which I was invited to be their president this year, I handpicked a few people to be on my executive committee or my board. And I said, what do you think the association needs? And what do you think your unique strengths are? And how can I support you to maximize your contribution? I took note of that. And for each of those people on my board, I make sure that I listen to them and help them feel that they are making a difference. Now, we all go to work for a paycheck, but what we really go to work for is once the roof over our head is covered and then we've got food in our bellies, it is about significance. It is about legacy. It's about purpose. And so those are the frames that you should focus on, whether you're leading volunteers or you're leading people who are on the payroll.
Okay. And the last question we have before Ricardo would conclude with you would be a question from Mr. Dr. Huck. Can you share experiences on how to accelerate servant leadership?
Well, first we'd have to define what servant leadership is, right? So here's the reality of all of the leadership models, whether we could call it transformational leadership, path goal leadership, servant leadership. I understand that in terms of servant leadership, it is a frame that says, the leader, it's not all about the leader's ego. It is about empowering and engaging others. And so the approach that I take is that when the followers feel connected to the purpose, to the mission, to the why, you've empowered them to have self-leadership, the practice of intentionally influencing their thinking, feeling, and actions towards what they feel are their objectives, then you have been a servant leader. And I would quote Lao Tzu. I lived in Asia for 17 years, and so I was impacted by Chinese philosophy. What did Lao Tzu say? He said, when the leader's job is done, the people said, we did it ourselves. And if that is your legacy, then I believe that is true servant leadership.
Well, we are reaching the end here. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. But I have a question before we go. How do people can find you and tell us about your business and what you are doing and how you can help European companies?
Well, I'd rather not do a full pitch here because it really depends on what people need. Personally, connect with me on LinkedIn. There's a huge amount of information. You know, the barcode on my screen should take you directly to my LinkedIn profile. If we're connected, you can send me a message and you can ask me a question. If you want to know more about my services, selfleadership.com, very simple. And you go through there and you can see a little bit about my history and the kind of work and the clients that I work with. So I'd absolutely, now that I'm here in Portugal, I'm not in Asia anymore, I would love to connect with people here in the European theater. And of course, you don't have to buy from me. I'm also interested in people who have interesting ideas. I love to learn and I'm learning every day. So reach out, ask me a question or contribute. Thank you.
Andrew, thank you so much for your time. Vincent, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for coming to watch our new guest and new approach, okay, from us at least. All right, thanks so much for coming. Have a great week and don't forget to subscribe to the ECXO. Thank you so much and have a great week.